Thank you very much for joining us today, and what I'm going to do is to just give you a brief outline of the Alliance 21 project, which is a project of the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, and then the others will fill in the pieces. I'll be followed by my colleague Geoff Garrett, who until recently was the Chief Executive of the US Study Centre, and he will talk more specifically about the trade and investment theme. And then, according to this running order, Virginia Greville, who heads up DFAT's office here in Sydney and who's a partner with us today in putting this event on, will speak. And then Andrew Stoller, former deputy head of the World Trade Organisation, who's been organising the specifics of our contribution on trade and investment, will complete this welcome. Really more than a welcome, it's to try and set the scene for the day. So just to give you a little background, the United States Study Centre exists to further better Australian-US relations in terms of education, public information and the like, and one of the ways in which it does it is to run a small think tank which basically works in collaboration with the United States in looking at areas of public policy that are of relevance to both countries, and not only relevance to each of our two countries, but also how it might relate to third and other countries. For example, how the Australian-US relationship is relevant in terms of what's happening in our own region, in the Asia-Pacific region. And and under that idea of that think tank looking at public policy between our two countries, we invented this idea of looking at the alliance, the Australian-US alliance, in much broader terms than just a security treaty. And we did that because, thinking about the relationship between Australia and the US, we realised in effect that a security treaty is only as good as the strength of the underlying relationship. And the underlying relationship between Australia and the US is a complex and multifaceted thing. And perhaps we, on this side of the Pacific, don't give enough thought to how it works and how we can invest in it and strengthen it, which in turn will reap dividends in providing the strongest possible foundation for the security alliance that I just mentioned. And we think it's an interesting way to look at Australian-US relationship, and it was worth giving it some serious thought. And we devised this project, which the Australian government, we're pleased, was prepared to back, and which a whole range of corporates on the US side, they're all global corporates, were also prepared to support. So it's a 3-year project looking at the alliance in much broader terms than is generally the case. And when we broke it down into themes, we obviously realised that the theme of trade and investment is a critical part of that foundation. And whereas we know we trade with each other and we invest with each other, and through that we have trade and investment relationships with third countries, in terms of what's the public policy that underlies that trade and investment relationship, we found there's not a lot of thought given on this within Australia, and actually there's probably even less thought given on the US side. So we therefore picked that as an important theme through which we should drill down and see if there were areas of public policy to which we could make a contribution that could further strengthen the framework for trade and investment between Australia and the US in the future, which in terms would contribute to a further strengthening of the relationship as a whole. So that's what we're about over this 3-year project, and this is our second event under the trade and investment theme. And I'm now going to, in welcoming you, welcome Geoff Garrett and invite him to just say a few words on why trade and investment. When we started this, the suggestion was trade. Garrett was strongly of the view that actually the investment side of the Australian-US relationship is just as important, if not more important, and you can't look at one without the other. So I suspect he's going to give us a few words on that at the moment. So thank you for joining us for the day. I hope you find it interesting and worthwhile. We certainly appreciate your contribution, and I now invite Geoff Garrett to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Robert, and good morning and welcome, everybody. Robert and I have the real honour and privilege and pleasure of co-directing the Alliance 21 project, and I wanted to thank Robert publicly for the incredible job that he is doing in the themes that are more his than they are mine, on energy security, on natural resources and the environment, and on defence and security. But on the other side of the house, which is really a little more about business and economics than it is about politics and military, I've taken a more active interest. And the reason I think it is so critical for us to be doing this work and for us to be holding this event today is that it's my sense that the Australian public debate about where Australia fits and about Australia's relationship with the United States is really underdone when it comes to the economic side, business and economics, trade and investment. So let me start with what I think are I'll start and end with 3 or 4 important misperceptions, I believe, or understandings in Australia about the economic side of the US-Australia relationship. So the first one, I think, is that the perception in Australia today, obviously, is that the United States is yesterday's economic power, and that therefore, when Australia thinks about its place in the world, it's balancing on the one hand an economic investment in Asia with a geopolitical relationship with the West, led by the United States on the other. It seems to me that the glibbest way to put this is that the United States isn't Greece. Where I was just watching the morning business shows, and of course we've got a countdown to the fiscal cliff going on at the moment. I hope and I'm certainly quite confident that the US will not walk off the fiscal cliff. But it does seem to me that the United States has a strategy at the moment, an implicit strategy at the moment, which says that European-style austerity is not only not what the US wants, it's not what the US needs, and that the US strategy going forward is going to be to grow its way out of debt and deficit, not cut its way out of debt and deficit. And clearly one important element of growing the US out of debt and deficit is the international economy, and not only trade, but all the money that American multinational firms are now making offshore, and surely the locus of that is going to be Trans-Pacific. So point one is, I think Australians tend to write off the US a little too quickly when it comes to the economy, and I'm certainly, I think that 2013 might be a better year for the US than many people think, because of all the cash that is in corporate pockets. But that going forward, it's not implausible that the US will return to a 3+% growth rate where it's been really since World War II, and so the US isn't going away as an economic power, point one. Point two, when it comes to the US-Australia economic relationship, to the extent that anyone is focusing attention on it in Australia, there tends to be criticism, and the criticism says, listen, we signed a free trade agreement with the United States 6 or 7 years ago. All that's happened since then is that our trade deficit, our bilateral trade deficit with the US has increased. Point one. Point two, we don't have a free trade agreement with China, but all that's happened over the same period is that our trade surplus with China has gone up and up and up. So it really was, therefore, maybe a mistake, or at best irrelevant, for Australia to sign the free trade agreement with the United States in 2005. I don't think that's right either, because of the point that Robert alluded to. If you look at the statistics, the economic statistic that jumps out at you, including resisting the massive downturn, the global financial crisis downturn, is the incredible growth in two-way investment between Australia and the US since the Free Trade Agreement was signed in 2005. And, we hear a lot today in Australia about Chinese investment in Australia. Last time I looked at the numbers, accumulated Chinese investment in Australia was on the order of $20 billion. Accumulated American investment, depending on how you count it in Australia, is 30 times that, 600 billion or more. The US is the biggest investment game in town in Australia. And we see examples of that everywhere, but the lead example that's clearly in the news at the moment is Chevron, one of our partners' investment in Western Australia. Chevron has got on the books at minimum a $70 billion investment in Western Australia in natural gas. Australia's going to become the biggest natural gas exporter in the world very quickly. A lot of that is possible because of American investment. Sure, the Asian market matters, and maybe the US invests because of the Asian market, but US investment is critically important. So, point two, I think it would be unwise to write off as a bust, at best an irrelevant bust, the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement. Point three, Australia and the US today, and I think we'll hear that there are different perspectives in the two countries, but Australia and the US today have a massive economic and I think geopolitical investment in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the proto-free trade agreement for the Asia-Pacific. Now, that world has become a little more complicated, obviously, in the past couple of weeks because ASEAN Plus 6 has now come out with its own comprehensive economic partnership for East Asia. Australia is in and the Prime Minister supported it. The US is not in, but Australia is also in TPP. Now, it's clear that President Obama has invested a lot of his international economic capital and maybe a lot of his diplomatic capital more generally in the success of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if you think about the so-called US pivot to Asia, or the rebalancing towards Asia, it's clear that for the Obama administration that's about more than politics and military and troops in Marines in Darwin. The economic side of that pivot is really, really important. And Obama's term, as you all know, is the rules of the road. I think what the US is hoping to do with the Trans-Pacific Partnership is create a high-level free trade agreement that'll write the rules of the road for economic cooperation in the Asia-Pacific in the 21st century. Australia is a key player there. And Australia's challenge, clearly, is to work with the US on ensuring that TPP succeeds, but at the same time making sure that Australia's interests are protected in that process. And I think that's going to be a delicate and difficult balancing act going forward, but it's a really important one that a lot of people aren't paying very much attention to. And now my last point, which will bring me back to the beginning. I think one thing that we tend to forget in Australia, but that Americans who are close to the ground always understand, is that free trade agreements and international economic agreements more generally in the US are at least as much about geopolitics as they are about economics. Things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership don't only happen because they're welfare improving in some economic textbook sense. They happen because they fit in a broader geopolitical frame in terms of what the national interest for the country is. So I was very pleased, I am very pleased that in so many of the papers for today's conference, we have that appreciation. Yes, people are very concerned about sometimes the quite arcane technicalities of international economic agreements and how the global economy works. But at the same time, this broader frame, the fact that trade and investment is important on its own, but part of a bigger geopolitical picture which should never be too far from our minds. So it is for that reason that I think it's very important we have not only the trade and investment theme, but this conference today. And my handoff to Virginia Greville from DFAT, and as I always say to foreigners, Australians love acronyms probably more than anybody else beyond the Pentagon in the US. But I always think that you've got to be a diplomat of considerable aplomb to be able to walk up to somebody who's not from Australia and say, "Hi, I work for DFAT," with a straight face. You know, the only other acronym I find harder in Australia is an internal one, the corruption acronym, ICAC. Hi, I'm from ICAC. But DFAT's a bit of a challenge. But DFAT, of course, in Australia again for our American visitors, is an unusual institution because Australia thinks that foreign affairs and trade go together. So yes, we have two ministers, but the head department has both functions, including doing all the negotiations for international economic agreements like TPP. And DFAT thinks that the commercial side is sufficiently important that it has a very important office in Sydney, in New South Wales, which Virginia heads. So I hope that's a reasonable handoff to you. I hope I haven't spoken too long. All I wanted to say is that you all know this, but I think the broader public tends not to understand it. The trade and investment side is just really important when it comes to Australia-US. Don't only think about the alliance as a political military one. Perhaps Virginia will pick up that baton right here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'd like to join in welcoming you all here and to thank Alliance 21 and the US Study Centre for offering DFAT the opportunity to be involved in this conference. I have to say DFAT is an ugly acronym. I used to work for the Department of Primary Industries and Energy, which was dopey, and then it changed its name to DAF. So for me, DFAT's a step up in the world. Anyway, this is a very exciting topic, and it's very timely to be considering these issues right now as our policy institutions and practitioners grapple with the complexities of balancing competing priorities, of growing our engagement with Asia and our Asian literacy, while maintaining and strengthening other traditional and cultural alliances. And I look forward to hearing the presentations today. I just thought I'd do a bit of personal introduction to explain my particular interest in this topic. As Geoffrey said, I'm the State Director of the New South Wales Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, perhaps we can be formal and call it that. I've been with that department more or less since 2000, and the bulk of my experience has been as a trade negotiator, dealing with those arcane and slightly weird provisions that are in trade and economic agreements. I was posted in Washington, DC from 2000 to 2003, the extraordinary years of the Clinton-Bush changeover, of 9/11, and the launch of the Doha round. And of course, those were the years during which Australia and the Australian Embassy, where I worked, were working very hard to convince the United States to agree to an FTA negotiation, and it was a difficult challenge to get the US to agree to that. My position was Minister Councillor Agriculture, and in those early discussions it was largely agriculture and quarantine issues that gave the Americans the most pause, so it was quite a big job. In the end, while agricultural issues were significant, as the presenters will tell you later in the US FTA segment, other issues, including intellectual property and the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, became more contentious. So I was the senior representative of the agriculture portfolio on the negotiating team, including on SPS, which is quarantine matters, and had continuing responsibility then in DFAT for the overall ratification and implementation of the agreement, which was an extraordinary process, as Robert Hill, who did the heavy lifting in the Senate, may remember, through 2004, leading up to its entry into force in 2005. Since then, I worked on the Australia-China FTA as lead negotiator in agriculture for 2 years. I was deputy chief negotiator for a time on the Australia Gulf Cooperation Council FTA, each of which is yet to be concluded. And then I was chief negotiator for the Australia-Chile FTA, which happily entered into force in March 2009. I then served in Chile and returned only 3 months ago. I detail this experience to provide some context for comments I may make later in the day, particularly in the sessions on FTAs. Trade negotiators sometimes, not always, can be a little sensitive about after-the-event analysis of all the things they did wrong in a negotiation, and I may feel the need to defend our performance. But once again, I'd like to congratulate the organisers for the stellar lineup of authors and commentators that they have assembled here today, and I look forward to the presentations and discussions ahead of us. And I will hand over now to Andrew Stoller, whose biographical details are in front of you, and who was responsible for approaching me, actually, and asking for DFAT to partner in this. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Virginia. My name's Andrew Stoller, and I'm the theme leader for this trade and investment project theme of the Alliance 21 project. This conference is, in a sense, the sort of quasi-culmination of a lot of work that's taken place over the past year including a writers' workshop that included many of our writers held in Hawaii in May. And since that meeting, we've been working together and sharing views on each other's contributions to try to help with the crafting of the various papers and the presentations that you'll be hearing in the course of the day. Given all the work that our theme contributors have put into this project over the past year, it's great to see the large number of you who have taken interest in the project. Let me start again by thanking Virginia for agreeing to co-badge this event with the United States Study Center and the Alliance 21 project. As you know from the agenda and what you've heard from the other speakers this morning, we're going to be covering a broad range of trade and investment themes over the course of the day. Our hope is that by the end of the day's proceedings, we will all have a refreshed appreciation of the factors that affect the trade and investment dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region and how the changing environment impacts on the United States, Australia, and the Australia-U.S. relationship. This refreshed appreciation will be based in part on what you hear from our speakers, but it will also be important for you to react to and challenge what the speakers say. We want the conference to be interactive, and that's critical to success of the overall project because this conference, taken as a whole, is going to form the basis of a next step in the Alliance 21 project designed to bring together the threads of the topic. Now, as you've already heard and you can see from your programs, we have an impressive group of Australian and American contributors who will be presenting their views to you today, and their biographical details are in the package I think that you have in front of you on the table. The contributions made by our experts are individual efforts, and they reflect the views of the authors themselves, and that should not necessarily be taken to be the views of the institutions that they're working with. We'll be kicking off in a few minutes with Mark Beeson and Claude Barfield exploring the respective roles and strategies of Australia and the United States in the 21st century Asia-Pacific economic and security environment. I'll moderate that session where we'll examine, among other things, whether, as some people suggest, Australia may need someday to choose between its relations with China and the United States. After morning tea, Josh Meltzer and Peter Gallagher will be discussing climate change, technology, and some of the factors likely to impact competitiveness in our region in the proximate future. And Joanna Shelton will be our moderator for that exercise. The lunchtime program will see Alliance 21 co-chair Jeff Garrett examine the future of the Asia-Pacific economy with John Denton, Warwick Smith, and Anna Boodles. And I'm sure you'll enjoy that conversation. I'm convinced it's going to add considerable value to our conference. After lunch, Virginia Greville will moderate a session where Roger Farrell and Marianne Kelton will evaluate the impact of the Australia-US FTA. Controversial at the time it was negotiated, this agreement's been in force now for quite a few years, and we'll be asking the question, I think, how has it altered the bilateral relationship and affected both countries' standing in the region? In our final session today, Jeff Garrett, Ann Kapling, John Ravenhill, and Joanna Shelton will take an in-depth look at the ongoing Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiations. Will the TPP, in fact, succeed as a 21st century trade agreement? Will it deliver tangible positive results for Australia and the United States? And how will the TPP interact with other developments in our regional trade and investment architecture? So that's a summary of the program for today. I think you're going to find it quite interesting and hopefully stimulating and bring on some comments from you in response to what the speakers say. In a minute, we'll kick off with our first session, and let me just remind you again that we're hoping for an interactive conference today, so please don't be shy. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now allow me to welcome you to the first session of the conference today. In this first session, we'll be exploring Australia and the U.S. in the 21st century Asia-Pacific economic and security environment. Our speakers in this session are Professor Mark Beeson and Mr. Claude Barfield. As you know from the background notes, Mark is a professor of political science at the University of Western Australia, and Claude is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Mark is going to be our first speaker today, and then we'll invite Claude to the podium. We'll hold off on questions and answers until after both speakers have had a chance to take the floor, and then we'll open it up for Q's and A's from the floor. Now, I don't want to summarize in any way what Mark's going to say, but just to introduce his contribution, Mark, I believe, will be arguing that one of the defining international problems for Australia in the foreseeable future will be navigating between the demands of its chief economic, China, and strategic United States partners. And he'll be asking the question of whether Australia now has particular interests and perspectives that might best be served by adopting a genuinely independent foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific region. And without any further ado, Mark, I'd like to invite you up to the mic.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks to Andy for inviting me to be part of this tremendous program, and thanks to the US Studies Centre for asking me as well. It's a great project. I've been asked to say something about Australia's place in the region and how we might think about policy in the future. And one of the first points to make, I think, is that many people think that Australia at the moment has never had it so good. While many other economies in the world were struggling with the global financial crisis, Australia appeared to be immune and not as badly affected as many other parts of the world. Much of the credit for this very fortunate state of affairs was attributed to Australia's geographical position and natural endowments. Located alongside the world's most dynamic economic region and possessing the resources that East Asia's rapid industrialization increasingly required, Australia did indeed look like the lucky country. However, it's important to remember that when Donald Horne famously described Australia as the lucky country in the 1960s, he was actually being ironic. Horne was pessimistic about the prospects of a country relying on natural resources to mitigate the shortcomings of what he considered to be Australia's second-rate political leadership. Australia was lucky in that it could get away with failings that the resource wealth might have exposed in less fortunate countries. Although Australia's political class is arguably a good deal more professional, competent, and sophisticated than it was in the 1960s, some of the problems that Horne identified are strikingly familiar half a century later. Australia is once again highly dependent on its resource wealth to underpin national welfare, and increasingly reliant on a single country to absorb ever greater amounts of its commodity exports. In some ways, despite all of the emphasis that's been placed on economic reform and becoming a clever country, over the last few decades, important features of Australia's economic profile remain troublingly familiar. But while some aspects of Australia's relationship with its neighbours remain the same, some are novel and present new challenges for the current generation of policymakers. At the centre of the new economic and political realities that are shaping Australia's region is the relationship between China and the United States. The inherently contradictory, potentially antagonistic and unstable Sino-US relationship will help to determine what sort of region Australian policymakers actually have to deal with. Navigating between the competing demands of economic and strategic partners will be the defining international problem for the foreseeable future. The Chinese government has, for example, pointedly indicated its displeasure about the recent decision to station American troops in Darwin, and indicated that this could have negative consequences for Sino-Australian ties. This overarching strategic context adds yet another level of complexity to the whole process of quote-unquote Asian engagement. But before we can even begin to consider how Australia fits into what is now described as the Asian century, it's important to say something about the identity of the region and the nature of the engagement process itself. The underlying logic that informs Australia's economic engagement with the region is the notion of complementarity. This is one of the most fundamental of economic principles. According to the theory of comparative advantage, nations should do what they are naturally best at. In this case, Australia's resources complement the East Asian economy's hunger for raw materials and energy. East Asia's large labour force can transform Australian iron ore into manufactured goods, which can then be exported to Australia in return. Both parties in this exchange get to specialise and therefore increase overall economic efficiency and welfare. While this model captures something important about the basis of the relationship and the policies that seek to facilitate it, the nature of international economic activity has changed profoundly since David Ricardo first posited the merits of comparative advantage at the beginning of the 19th century. The world is no longer composed of discrete, highly differentiated national economies. Not only do countries in the developed world often produce very similar products, but the nature of trade itself has changed profoundly. The production and movement of goods in the contemporary era frequently takes place within production networks that transcend national borders. In the manufacturing sector in particular, the production process has been disaggregated into increasingly smaller parts and located wherever specific advantages are to be found. The new architecture of global and regional production is both good and bad news for Australia. One of the reasons new regional production networks have grown up in Southeast Asia is because the region has a significant comparative advantage in cheap and abundant labour. This is plainly something with which Australian-based economic actors cannot and probably would not want to compete. The long-term decline of the textile, clothing and footwear sector in Australia is testimony to the implacable impact of competition from the region's low-cost, newly industrialising economies. Many would see this as no bad thing. Our Asian neighbours get to take off, creating millions of newly affluent consumers, to say nothing of potentially more stable political systems as an educated middle-class population acts as a force for social stability. Many of the jobs that are lost to cheaper producers are often low skill and low pay. So this is also not necessarily something for policymakers to be overly concerned about either. Further up the value chain, however, things get more complicated. One of the most enduring debates amongst political economists is about how much manufacturing matters. Labour-intensive manufacturing has been an essential component in the story of successful industrialisation and economic development everywhere. The manufacturing sector in Australia has also been an historically important part of overall national development and a source of well-paid blue-collar jobs. It's important to remember that Australia's manufacturing sector emerged within a protective cocoon of tariffs, without which it would have been difficult for it to have developed in quite the way that it did. The process of state-supported development is essentially the story of successful industrialisation everywhere throughout history. So Australia is not unusual in that regard. The question now, however, in an era of trade liberalisation and when industry policies are generally out of fashion, is what, if anything, should states do to ensure the survival of manufacturing? The calculus here is not simply economic, although even here the debates are complex and contested. Manufacturing, especially further up the value chain in places like Australia, is associated with a skilled, technologically literate workforce. Such skills take time to develop and may be lost if the manufacturing sector declines. Manufacturing is also associated with so-called spillovers, or innovation and the creation of new products and industries that might not occur in the absence of an established industrial base. The policy dilemma for governments is highlighted in the subsidies offered to Australia's car industry. From the perspective of a potentially footloose global manufacturer, it might make a good deal of sense to service the relatively small Australian market from low-cost Asia, where integrated region-wide production structures generate major economies of scale. Thus far, Australian governments have, quote-unquote, given in to the demands of the auto industry, and it remains the backbone of a viable manufacturing sector as a consequence. Whatever the merits of such policies, they are an implicit recognition of the potential downside of economic liberalisation and the exclusive reliance on market forces to compel economic efficiencies and restructuring. Debates about the relative merits of the manufacturing sector and government efforts to sustain it have suddenly become more prominent because of the rise of the resource sector. The structure of Australia's national economy has inevitably changed over time, but what is especially noteworthy in an era of growing international economic interdependence is how rapidly and powerful economic forces can be transmitted around the world. In Australia's case, such processes have culminated in an unprecedented resource boom and now what looks like an almost inevitable downturn. Resource booms have generally been associated with dramatic shifts in the terms of trade. In this regard, the recent peak in the terms of trade is unprecedented in only one crucial regard: its sheer scale. The current boom is distinguished and fueled by equally unprecedented levels of investment in the resource sector. At first blush, this too looks like an unambiguously good outcome for Australia, and in many ways, of course, it is. Australia has traditionally relied on very heavily on foreign capital to develop assets that might otherwise have remained unexploited. And yet we need to remember that in the context of this discussion, Australia is actually a convenient abstraction and shorthand for a complex array of economic actors who are affected by structural change in very different ways. While the mining sector in particular has, until recently at least, struggled to find enough skilled workers to fill the vacancies created by the rapid increase in investment, other sectors of the economy are actually shrinking or struggling to contend with an equally dramatic increase in the value of the Australian dollar. The relative standing of other sectors of the economy is important, not least because of their role as sources of employment. Despite the fact that the mining sector in particular has difficulty filling specialist positions, the sector as a whole only employs around 2% of the population, or less than 250,000 people out of a total national workforce of over 11 million. As in other developed economies, employment in Australia is increasingly centred in the service sector, in traditionally low-pay occupations such as healthcare and retail. Even in parts of the service sector that are associated with better paid jobs, such as education, one of Australia's most important export industries is actually struggling to compete internationally as a result of the rapidly appreciating resource-driven dollar. Although this picture could change dramatically in the event of an international economic downturn and a not unprecedented plunge in the value of the dollar, the impact of the resource boom on the rest of the economy is raising difficult short-term and long-term questions. Most immediately, the capacity or indeed the willingness of the workforce to seamlessly shift in response to market signals looks debatable at best. Not only do many of the workers who lose their jobs in one section of the economy not have the skills to move easily into another, but some plainly are not interested in doing so, even if the economic incentives are significant. The longer-term question in the aftermath of what seems like an inevitable downturn is, how will Australians make a living in the future? The danger of structural change that is driven overwhelmingly by the market is that it may leave Australia's workforce ill-equipped to deal with future economic challenges. The question, therefore, is, can the boom be managed in the long-term, quote-unquote, national interest? Any public policy inevitably produces winners and losers. In this regard, economic and political power are tightly linked, as political authorities have the power to shape the governance structures and institutions that determine economic outcomes. The so-called resource curse is generally associated with the developing world, but the dynamic nature of resource development may unleash forces that test the management credentials and the political foundations of even the most established democracies. Concerns associated with the resource curse are basically twofold. At its most benign, the resource curse refers to a process of possibly distorted development as a focus on the growth of the resource sector at the expense of other economic activities creates problems of over-specialization and resource dependency. Of even greater concern, however, is the possibility that the dominance of one section of the economy will lead to a concomitant political ascendancy. Even in Australia, the political process has begun to be influenced by the profound impact of vast resource wealth. The scale of the wealth being generated by mining is remarkable. Profits exceeded $50 billion in the year 2009-10. Complicating the policy response further is the fact that the mining sector is more than 80% foreign-owned and has resulted in over $40 billion worth of pre-tax mining profits flowing overseas in the same year. The second point to note is that the mining industry pays a comparatively low rate of tax at the best of times, or nothing at all in the current tax year, much to the government's embarrassment. It's not necessary to be xenophobic or anti-mining to recognise that this pattern of taxation of foreign ownership has potentially major implications for domestic public policy and the manner in which the benefits of the boom are realised. Two aspects of this issue are especially important, it seems to me. First, from the perspective of distributional justice, any government's ability to share the benefits that might be expected to flow to Australians will be hampered by the fact that there is actually less wealth to distribute if profits go offshore and tax is minimised. Second, those stakeholders who do benefit disproportionately from the boom have actively sought to protect their interests, One of the most striking and politically contentious aspects of the current boom has been the willingness of prominent mining companies and their owners to use their economic resources to influence public policy in their favour. Some may argue that in a democracy, it's entirely appropriate that private interests are able to express opinions, but the scale of the resources that it's been able to mobilise in support of its collective position has caused concern. There is little doubt that the mining lobby's media blitz in opposition to the proposed mining tax played a major part in undermining the popularity and position of the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, ultimately contributing to his political downfall. At the very least, such events point to an important shift in the relative balance of power between key economic and political actors in Australia, changes that may have profound long-term consequences for both domestic policy and international relations. The risk of the resource sector, the rise of the Freudian slip, no doubt. The rise of the resource sector is having an equally consequential impact on some of Australia's most important international relationships as well. Although China has replaced Japan as the principal destination for Australia's exports, some of the problems that characterised the way that the resource trade was conducted in the 1970s and 1980s have re-emerged in Sino-Australian ties. Such concerns are amplified by the fact that China is a potential strategic threat, according to Australian government defence white papers, at least. At the heart of concerns about China is the possibility that, like Japan before it, China is using strategic investments and its overall economic weight to achieve resource security and put downward pressure on commodity prices. In this regard, it's not so different from any other trade partner, perhaps. But what distinguishes China, of course, is the nature of business-government relations in what is still notionally a quote-unquote communist country. That the emergence of so-called state capitalism, in which economic activity has a pivotal political importance, and in which governments seek to retain a high degree of control over what are considered to be strategically important economic assets and entities, is complicating relations between Australia and China. Significantly, the Foreign Investment Review Board began to rethink its policies towards foreign investment while Kevin Rudd, who describes himself as a quote-unquote brutal realist when it comes to China, was Foreign Minister. From having a situation in which investment applications were routinely approved, the Foreign Investment Review Board was forced to concede in 2011 that it was seeking to limit investment from China because of concerns about possible strategic investments in the mining sector. Equally significantly, the government was being encouraged in this newly interventionist policy by the heads of major resources companies such as BHP. The idea that there may be a good or bad investment is presenting new challenges for Australian policymakers who've traditionally welcomed foreign investment of all kinds. Although there were similar worries about Japanese real estate investment in the 1980s, from a foreign policy perspective, Japan had the great merit of being a close strategic ally. China, by contrast, is seen as a greater challenge, in part because it's seen as a potential strategic threat and a rival to Australia's principal security guarantor, the United States. As a result, the difficulty of managing the bilateral relationship with China is compounded not just by the fact that its political economy is organised along profoundly different principles, but because it is still regarded as a potential security threat in the heart of Australia's neighbourhood. Australia is not alone in confronting a new world order in which the underlying logic and rationale of economic and strategic policy appear to be diverging. The increasing complexity of regional production networks that transcend national borders is making a simple calculation of economic national interest increasingly complex. Indeed, the very idea of national champions, or even discrete national economies for that matter, has become more uncertain as consequences of disaggregated economic process. And yet, paradoxically enough, at the very moment that questions of national economic identity appear to be becoming less central in countries such as Australia, national governments continue to take a prominent role in determining the course and content of economic development elsewhere. The emergence of state capitalism in China, in particular, presents major economic and diplomatic challenges for Australia. The key issue for Australian policymakers, therefore, is whether they can reconcile economic interests with long-term geopolitical commitments. Bob Carr, our foreign minister, has been at pains to reassure China that the stationing of American troops in northern Australia is not a new attempt to contain China, but simply part of a long-term evolution of Australia's relationship with the United States. The recently released white paper carries much the same message. Whether the Chinese can be persuaded to see things this way remains to be seen. The fact that Australian foreign policy officials are having to finesse and explain such developments in this way is, however, a revealing indicator of the difficult balancing act that they confront. They had better get used to it. It's likely to be the defining policy issue of the 21st century. Let me just conclude with a couple of brief observations. Andy asked all of the contributors to make some policy recommendations. I was particularly loath to do so, but I've had a go at this particular challenge, and my two suggestions would be as follows. One would be reasonably conventional, if somewhat unlikely, and that would be to establish a sovereign wealth fund along the lines of the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund that was specifically charged with trying to manage the value of the Australian currency and put downward pressure on the Australian currency in the long term. To also invest for long-term intergenerational equity and welfare, to put some of the resource wealth away for a rainy day, if you like. That would be one suggestion. My other suggestion, I think, is even more unlikely to be taken terribly seriously, but that's what Andy was alluding to in his introductory remarks, and that's the suggestion that Australia might want to begin to try thinking about creating an actually independent foreign policy that actually reflects, quote-unquote, Australian national interests. I've been making this argument for at least 10 years now, and nobody's taken any notice thus far, but I was delighted to see the other day that Paul Keating made a speech along similar lines, and I suspect that Paul Keating has a good deal more weight than I do in these sorts of debates, so hopefully that particular issue may get a little bit more attention than it has done thus far. But thanks very much. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you also for sticking to the sort of notional limit of about 20 minutes for comments so that we have enough time for questions and answers later on. We're now going to give the floor to Claude Barfield. Earlier today you heard Jeff Garrett observe that for the United States, trade agreements have been at least as much a political exercise as an economic one. I think in his presentation, Claude will make the case that American economic and trade goals have long been inextricably linked to the country's broader diplomatic and security interests. And in this connection, I believe he'll be observing that negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership are at the central intersection of trade and diplomatic security policy, so that success or failure in the TPP will have important strategic repercussions. We'll be talking a little bit more detail about TPP later this afternoon, but I believe that's one of the issues you'll hear Claude commenting on. And without further ado, Claude, if you could come up. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the U.S. Study Center here also and the Alliance 21 for inviting me. In my ancient years, this is the first time I've ever been to Australia. And it's been a real pleasure for the last couple of days. Not least as when I left Washington, it hadn't happened yet. What the prediction was for our first cold, rain, sleety week. It was just going to be the beginning of a gray winter. Yesterday, I was fortunate enough to take one of your ferries, hop off the ferry, and find a farmer's market where they had freshly picked strawberries. God, what a wonderful feeling. And I also took that with some good Australian champagne, and so I had a really nice introduction yesterday afternoon to Australia. As Andy said, the title of the paper that I wrote was called The United States and East Asian Regionalism, Balancing Economics and Security. And I will stop after 20 minutes, no matter where I am. So let me give you a couple of takeaways before I plunge into. I'm going to go over a little bit of history over the last 3 or 4 administrations to explain the juxtaposition of trade policy on the one hand, foreign policy and security policy on the other. And let me give you 4 or 5 things to sort of tie things together, or hopefully I'll tie them together. One, it's often been said by academics and other commentators that the United States policy towards Asia, particularly East Asia, has been erratic, reactive, sporadic. And I think if you take a given small set of years, let's say particularly the end of the Clinton administration, the beginning years of the second Bush administration, you could make that case. But looking back over the last 4 administrations, starting with Bush 1, then Clinton, then Bush 2, and then now Obama, I think I would find, and I do find, a remarkable continuity of goals. And that is all the more striking because we have a situation where these were very different administrations in their domestic policies and also to some, certainly recently, and certainly with the Bush 2 and Obama with foreign policy. And the other thing that makes it extraordinary is that one of our parties, the Democratic Party, Mr. Obama's party, has been deeply divided on trade and globalization issues since the early 1990s, symbolically since the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's not generally known, I suspect, out here, but whether you had a Democratic or Republican president, only once or twice have the president, even a Democratic president, been able to mobilize a majority of the Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives in favor of a particular free trade agreement. So we have that particular situation. The third thing is that I think, and Andy mentioned this, and Jeff Garrett mentioned this also at the beginning, that in the United States, but I would take this beyond the United States. I think this is true of Australia, it would be true of any country. There is an inextricable combination of trade policy on the one hand and international economic policy and defense and security policy on the other. That has certainly been true, I think, in the United States, but if you look at what has been said already and will be said during the day about Australia, there will be inevitably, when these decisions come to the Prime Minister's office, yes, he or she may have advice from the trade side, from the security side, from the political side, but it all comes together. And so in that office, and that is true in the United States White House, you have the trade representative, you have the State Department, you have defense people, and the White House staff and the president ultimately must make these decisions balancing these things. And I mentioned this in terms of Australia. It would be true with, let's say, Colombia and South America, where Colombia and Chile, for instance, have bilateral agreements with the United States, but there is the inevitable pressure to also hook up with Mercosur, which is the other big trade alliance down there, and that has political implications. So my point is that I think no matter what the nation is, you have that balancing. And I would argue that also, just in terms of trade policy, once you get away from multilateral negotiations in the GATT or the WTO, where you're sitting at a table and all you're dealing with are trade issues, and when you get to a bilateral or a trilateral or a regional agreement, inevitably your choices, into your choices come political and diplomatic or security reasons. It's just, it happens, it is inevitable. Another point is that I think in the United States, finally, before I plunge into this, the role of individuals in terms of this combination of economic and security policy has been quite important. And I will pick in the minutes as I go through this, the role of Secretary of State James Baker under the first Bush administration, in the late 1880s, early 1990s. The role of Robert Zoellick, who was the U.S. Trade Representative who went on to become the head of the World Bank in the second Bush administration, Bush 2 administration. And in the current administration, the role of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They have had crucial, I think, they've been crucial decision makers. Now let me just, I'm going to hop, in the paper that I wrote, I have some comments about what's been happening in Asia. I'm going to be ruthless in the next 15 minutes that I have to just talk about with the United States itself. And let me just go back then to the Bush 1 administration. Keep in mind that from 1945 to the late 1980s, the United States, might say you've had 1 or 1.5 trade policies. It was a strong leader in the GATT and then later, more recently, in the WTO. And it also had individual problems that would come up with individual nations, with the Japanese or with the Europeans, which were less formal negotiations. In the late 1980s, things began to change fairly dramatically. You had the end of the Cold War. You had, in terms of regionalism, Europe getting its act together to become, which became, in a sense, a glorified free trade agreement for all of Europe. And you had, with Japan, before Japan's travails began in the early 1990s, a pattern in which you look, the so-called flying geese pattern, which Japan seemed to be headed to lead an economic architecture out here in Asia. All of that kind of came together in the late 1980s, and you had at the same time, the United States was approached by both Canada and Mexico to change or evolve its trade policy to go into a regional agreement. We had only one agreement, by the way, before that, and that was with Israel, which makes my point. It was totally an agreement based on security and diplomatic support of Israel, and it was out of the ordinary at the time. But it was at this point that the decisions began to be made, and as I said, Secretary Baker was I think the central person here. To come back to Asia, you also had, for the first time, the appearance of what was a competing, it was very preliminary, a competing vision of an economic architecture in Asia, and that is Prime Minister Mahathir's proposal for an East Asia Economic Caucus. And that produced a kind of founding statement, if you will, that I think has guided other administrations, where Baker said that the United States has no intention ever of allowing a line to be drawn down the middle of the Pacific, with us on one side and the nations of Asia, and particularly East Asia, on the other. Now, when Baker wrote about that later in his memoirs, he made the point that while this was he was reacting to an economic proposal, he saw this in the larger strategic terms. And that kind of set the tone, if you will. We went on, beginning with Bush, but then following through with President Clinton, to other regional agreements. The APEC agreement, which was finished under President Clinton, and also what became an abortive free trade of the Americas agreement. I want to move now, because of time considerations, fairly quickly past the Clinton administration. The thing about the Clinton administration was that it occurred at the so-called brief unipolar moment. And so you did not have overtly so much to calculate in trade with security, with diplomacy. The Soviet Union was gone. China was not even on the horizon. So you didn't have that. But the Clinton administration was very concerned with non-economic issues in terms of what it wanted to do in trade, with human rights, with political institutions, with democracy. But it was with the Bush administration, I think, the Bush II administration, George W. Bush, that you really did get a formal setting out, actually, which makes it interesting, of criteria for how we would choose trade partners that linked explicitly U.S. diplomatic and security goals. Now, this was a time, obviously, to some degree, they were influenced, though I think we probably thought more influenced more than we thought at the time than I think in retrospect was the case, by 9/11, by what was happening in the Middle East. But it was Robert Zoellick who actually took the lead, and in U.S. trade policy, you never know. Sometimes the Secretary of State will have more influence. It was certainly true under Bush I, and today I think Secretary Clinton has more influence on trade. Robert Zoellick, who was the U.S. trade representative, was given a pretty free hand. I remember at the time the White House would complain that he was a kind of cowboy, would go off on his own because they were so much involved with Iraq and with the Middle East. And it was Zoellick who put forward, though with the president's approval, the several tenets, and were actually written down, that linked two things. One is the so-called competitive liberalization, where the United States had a formal reason, it said, for going into bilateral or trilateral or regional agreements, and that is, the thought was that you could build free trade, not just with the GATT, or the WTO, at the time, but through individual agreements. And that Zoellick said explicitly that we could use our market to push toward greater liberalization in trade throughout the world. The second thing that was important was a direct link between U.S. foreign policy and security goals and trade. The National Security Document of 2002, which they published, the white paper on U.S. national security, included a section on trade, that the United States would use trade to further its diplomatic goals. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, But what basically we had formally presented to the world was that in choosing our trading partners, we would not just look at the economic consequences, but also the political and security and diplomatic. And if you look at what the administration did, clearly some of the agreements that were bilateral agreements that were done under Bush had little economic consequence, particularly in the Middle East, Oman, Bahrain. It was true also that the United States out here, that in Asia, was Singapore, the aborted at time, but still there, negotiations with Malaysia and Thailand, and also the juxtaposition of Australia and New Zealand. One of the reasons Australia was pulled to the front of the line, as it were, was because of Australia's support of the Bush administration's foreign policy and security goals. One of the reasons that New Zealand was excluded was because of disagreements over diplomatic and security issues. I don't want to get into the details on it, I'm just saying that's the way things worked. And so we had presented to the world at that time a series of reasons that went beyond economic for the United States entering into trade agreements. Let me finish up with the Obama administration and finally with the TPP. Certainly in terms of foreign policy, security policy, you have great contrast. And also it is true that with the Obama administration, with President Obama himself, it was unlikely in 2009 that the United States was going to advance very far in terms of trade. Obama, as I said, inherited or led a party still deeply divided on trade. The Democrats in the House had held up trade agreements with Colombia and Panama and South Korea that the Bush administration had actually signed but had not been agreed to by the Congress. Obama famously had said that he would have opposed NAFTA had he had to vote on it, and that he also was proud of the fact that he had not been in favor of any of the free trade agreements that were passed while he was in the Senate under President Bush, or those before he got to the Senate. And so, at least for the first months, it didn't look as if, and to be fair to the Obama administration, they did have a fairly important crisis on their hands. So that they were looking internally because of the financial crisis. But here again, I think you see where events outside of economics become important, and also where individuals become important. Secretary of Clinton, before she came to office, had stated that she intended, this is before the term pivot was used, but she intended actually to look to Asia. And her first trip symbolically was to Asia and not to Europe, which was unusual, in fact, unique for a U.S. Secretary of State. But there were other things that happened in 2009. In the first place, the United States president had not been in office for very many months before the North Koreans began to act up, lobbing missiles over the East China Sea, a test of of underground nuclear weapon. You had also the situation where it preceded the Obama administration, but you saw the fruition of a dramatically changed diplomatic and political stance of China, of China's increasing belligerence, its increasing move to push its own, it's what it considered its own national interest. All of this kind of clux of issues forced the administration and the president himself, this becomes quite important, to think what should our next steps be here. There's a story that's went around Washington that I can't vouch entirely for, but it has a ring of truth to it. Obama and the president of Korea had gotten along very well. The president of Korea came to Washington in the spring of 2009, and then Obama was going back to meet with the president in the fall, and his point was, you just had all this happening with North Korea, and his point to his staff was, you know what, we need to do something to bolster. We need to show that we support Korea. And the staff, well, one of the things that you have not signed off on and we have not gone ahead with is the Korea Free Trade Agreement, the course. And what seems to be the case, they decided very quickly, okay, we will clear that. We will go forward with that. The reason, and against some of his worries about his own party, and the reason was that really they thought that what's happening in Asia, the diplomatic and security conditions there, meant that you really had to go forward. And the other thing that happened that was clearly the case, that they had in the Obama administration in the spring and summer had begun to make a big deal of the so-called pivot to Asia. And it was going to be very difficult to walk away from the Korean agreement and still defend that you were pivoting to Asia. And that brings me to the final point, that is about the TPP. It is inconceivable to me that the Obama administration would have initiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership on its own. But luckily for it and for us, I think, the outgoing Bush administration, Susan Schwab, who was the U.S. Trade Representative, lobbed a kind of dart forward to the new incoming administration, where in September 2008, she signaled that the United States would begin to enter negotiations with the then 4 countries, or it might have been 5 or 6 by that time, but anyway, the countries that were the nucleus of the Trans-Pacific Economic Partnership. And so when the Obama administration came into office, this decision was pending. It was a decision initially they did not want to make. But as you got into 2009, and I think here Secretary of State Clinton was key, and also I think Robert Gates and the Defense Department were saying, look, these are inextricably linked. We need to go forward. So in the fall of 2009, the administration agreed that it would formally join and take the lead, actually, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreements. So what you saw there is an administration, with the Obama administration, which was reluctant to advance, I think, on the trade side of the economic relationship, but I think backed into it because of the imperatives of what was happening out here in terms of U.S. diplomatic and security interests. And actually today, once that happened, President Obama, as he said, I think, out here in Australia a year ago, we were all in. It is now, I think, a signature issue for the president personally. And the final thing, two final things to note. We're looking at the president's trip last year out to Asia, and the fact that he doubled down again when he's just in the last couple of weeks when he came back to Cambodia, brought the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a key element of the pivot. It is, I think, the symbol. It's important to have the 2,500 Marines. It's important to have these new arrangements with the Philippines and Malaysia and Singapore. But I think out here, and I'll be interested to see reactions, I think it's the TPP and the Americans' U.S. ability to lead the TPP to a successful conclusion that will be really symbolic of whether the pivot is perceived of succeeding. And I think, and finally, I'm not going to get into the TPP because others are going to talk about this. My own feeling is that the crucial time is the next 9 to 10 months. That if we cannot reach an agreement at that point, things will begin to unravel, just as they did in the Doha round. But then I think that would be unfortunate for this reason. We've heard mention of the so-called fiscal cliff. However that is resolved, the United States is in, Geoffrey Garrett said we were not going to go into austerity, but we're certainly going to have a budget. We're going to have tight budgets for the next decade. And that means that in calculating where you put your money and where you put your defense versus other things, it's going to be tough decisions for the U.S. Congress. I think here is where, again, on a fundamental level, the TPP symbolically and the United security ability to sustain the security promises that we've made out here come together. If the TPP succeeds, I think it will be a great deal easier to persuade the U.S. Congress to put forward the resources that we would need to fulfill President Obama's implicit promises about the resources, the security resources, the military resources we will have out here, just in terms of the interest that you can present this to the American Congress. And so, finally, this is really the inextricable link that I'll leave it with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claude. We've been wired. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. The system's working. Right. Now you've heard our speakers' views on the positions of Australia and the United States in the Asia-Pacific, perhaps most specifically in the East Asian context. There are some differences in the Australian and U.S. perspectives here. I'm now going to open the floor for questions, and please, when you ask a question, identify yourself and the speaker to whom your question is addressed. So, floor is open. Yes, the gentleman there in the middle. Just a minute, you have a microphone coming to you.
Hello, my name is Trung Trung. I'm from the Institute of Transport and Logistics Study at the University of Sydney. I have a question and perhaps comment to Professor Mark Beeson. When we talk about trade, we usually think in terms of the Ricardian theory of trade, comparative advantage. You manufacture wine and you exchange for cloth, etc. Car versus agriculture. But then I think in your talk you also mentioned about supply chain, which I thought very interesting because especially coming from the Institute of Transport and Logistics Study, I always hear about supply chain all the time. My comment is like this. In the old way that the economists think about trade, we all think in terms of the Ricardian model. But perhaps that might be out of date, maybe 100 or 200 years out of date, because nowadays you look at trade, a lot of them are intra-sectorial, and in fact even between firms, intra-firm rather than between firms. So aren't we in the economic profession lack a new model, a new way of thinking? We've got to renovate our thinking. Even the statistic itself, you look at the national statistic, trade always between, in terms of commodity. But in fact, it should be in supply chain. Where do we add the value? And that underlines the fallacy in the debate about should Australia have a car manufacture industry or not? Because which part of the car should Australia concentrate our comparative advantage on? I mean, the car got thousands of parts. So my comment and also question to Professor Mark Beeson is that should it be about time that we think of trade, we use the word trade, but in a new way? And perhaps we should even add the word logistic or supply chain to the word trade, because if we keep on thinking about trade in the old-fashioned way, we're not going to deal with the real world nowadays, which is probably people in the trade negotiation know it's not about commodity, but in fact about so many parts of the commodity. So unless we have a new way of thinking about trade, our debate or our way of dealing with the issues may be a little bit out of date or unsatisfactory. With my question.
No, that's an excellent point. I think Peter's going to talk about this in more detail this afternoon, so I might leave it to him to say more about the way that the structure of trade actually works. I mean, my particular interest in this is just in trying to highlight some of the policy challenges that this throws up, because unless you understand how the structure of trade is being transformed in the region and where value is being added, then it's difficult to make sensible decisions about what policy might look like in order to support it or to encourage more high-value forms of trade and production within Australia. So I was mainly interested in trying to think about the policy challenges, and I'll leave it to others perhaps later on this afternoon to say more about the detail of that. But it's an important point for sure.
In the back of the room there, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Adrian Hearn from University of Sydney China Studies Centre. A question for Mr. Barfield about, I don't want to get too much into the TPP issues, as we'll do that later, but this relates to a comment you made about the linking of strategic and security interests with economic interests and objectives. Well, I just spent a month in Beijing asking people what they think about the TPP in China. And the main concern that I heard from everybody, actually, was that there are significant strategic and security elements of the TPP that seek to contain China. And so, whether or not that's true is maybe besides the point here. The point more is that I want to ask you about is, to what extent do you see the TPP as coinciding with efforts to build a stronger relationship with China on the part of the US, or to what extent, on the other hand, might the two actually diverge?
Well, a couple of things. I do not think here, I have been a critic, certainly, parts of the Obama administration's trade and other economic policies, but I do not think it'd be fairly said that the United States is entering into and pushing the TPP as a means of containing China. The United States and hopefully its trading partners have economic interest in terms of trade liberalization that hopefully they will be able to reconcile. That is, in terms of each nation has different economic interests of it, be able to reconcile. Now, it is true that it's going to, the TPP, as we'll talk more about today, goes well beyond the so-called border issues into regulatory issues, and even, as the Chinese worry about, into so-called state-owned enterprises. But that is not really, the aim of that is for trade liberalization, if you can achieve it. It is not just to contain China. The other thing to keep in mind is that the United States have been very careful here to say that China is eligible for membership just as any other nation in APEC, at a minimum. I mean, from the beginning, the implicit assumption is that all nations of APEC, when they are ready, will be able to join. You know, it's hard to, the Chinese may have their own reasons for not believing that. And they do see it, and as I said, there are strategic implications here. But it is also a very important, I think, advance in terms of trade liberalization. And so all you can do, as far as I'm concerned, the U.S. administration can do, is to keep reiterating that this is not actually aimed at China, except to the degree that the United States and hopefully its trading partners have certain fairly fixed, though evolving, views about the rules of the road for trade. And that's what this is all about. I would also like just one quick thing on the, I'll again defer to Peter Gallagher. I don't think that most economists think that the advent of supply chains really changes traditional comparative advantage theories. It adds to them, it supplements them. But what you've done really is to chop up comparative advantage. And that's a great thing for developing countries. They don't develop an automobile industry. They can do one part of it. You don't have to do the entire iPhone. You can do one piece of it. I think the trade statistic question is another big looming one, because our U.S. trade deficit with China, if you do it on a value-added basis, it's about a third or more less. The way we do things now, an iPhone comes out of China, it's counted as a totally Chinese product. It is not a totally Chinese product by any means. Anyway, I'll leave that for.
That's an important point, Claude. Okay, lady over here.
Yes. My name is Anna Boodles. This particular question is being asked with my hat of being a member of the Foreign Investment Review Board on, as opposed to potentially some other hats later in the day. I just wanted to maybe express a little bit of grumpiness with Mark when he said that in 2011 the Australian government decided to start limiting Chinese investment. I can hand on heart say that that is absolutely not the case. Yes, there were new policy rules, regulations introduced for betting SOEs, but being within the tent as opposed to outside the tent, we get SOE applications from the US, from Canada, from Norway, from China, from Qatar, from Singapore. They are all treated completely equally, and we really welcome Chinese investment.
Well, can I just say that, I mean, my understanding of this has been based on press reports, and they seem to have detailed it quite extensively, that thinking in the FIRB seems to have changed quite a lot, partly as a result of government sensitivity about the potential Chinese investment, and from a position where most investment applications seem to be weighed through with a minimum of scrutiny. I mean, don't know quite what goes on, but suddenly new rules, regulations, and degrees of oversight were being introduced which hadn't occurred before. So clearly there was heightened sensitivity on the part of the government about the strategic implications potentially of some of these kinds of investments. So I've got no first-hand exposure to this because quite a lot of the process is opaque anyway, and I have to base my understanding on second-hand press reports, but a lot of that seemed to be pretty consistent in suggesting that something quite significant had changed over the last year or two as a consequence, particularly of Chinese proposals.
Gentleman over here on this, right here. And then we'll come over to the table over here. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Jack Gilly. I'm a student at Scots College. Just speaking about China and trade with America, do you, just for Mr. Beeson and Mr. Barfield, just both of you to comment, would you say that the China-America debt loop exists? And
Sorry,
the China-America debt loop?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think it exists? And if it does, do you think that has any repercussions on Australia's trade with China in relation to commodities and mining? And also, does it have a place in agreements when you when you go to consider a trade with China? Would they be buying up your bonds and currency?
Nice, easy, straightforward question there. Then, so no, I think it's.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important question. And one of the more bizarre aspects of the contemporary international economy, it seems to me, is that symbiotic relationship between the United States and China, where China essentially lends the United States the money to buy its products and underpin American foreign policy, arguably to a large extent as well. And it's an unprecedented and unique sort of relationship. So far, it's been the proverbial win-win because both sides have benefited from it in significant ways. Whether it can be sustained, particularly if there are other kinds of forces that come to influence the relationship, geopolitical considerations, if China reacts badly to the idea that it thinks it's being contained in some way, that if new initiatives are designed to restrict its behavior in some ways, there may be things that it might want to try to do. Of course, there are limits to what China can do as well, because interdependence is a two-way street, and if China attempts to use its new economic leverage, it may precipitate a crisis from which it too will be a victim. So it's a really interesting, thus far stabilizing force in the international system, arguably. Whether it will continue to be so is a moot point, and I don't think anybody really knows that, because I think elements of the relationship are simply unprecedented in their scale and scope.
Well, I'd just like to pick on the last point that Mark Beeson made, and that is, I'm assuming that the Chinese leaders are quite rational, and if they were to bring down the bond market, they destroy themselves too. So it's not in their interest to do it. Governments can act irrationally, but I'm assuming they really won't do that. So I don't really worry. There also there's more diversification. I worry more about the circumstance that got the United States in having to borrow from anybody. So I come back actually to the United States domestic policy rather than foreign policy. I think in terms of pressure, I just done some work on it. It's the Europeans who really have to worry in terms of individual trade things. The whole business that Europe has just gone through in terms of trying to force other nations to have an airline emission standard. Joshua Meltzer is here somewhere, and he may disagree with this, where the Chinese basically said, okay, there were, I forget how many, 30 or 40 planes that were pending that they were going to buy, and they said, nope, well, we'll just put that off until the Europeans back down. The Europeans were in what is, I think, a humiliation, did have to back down. Now, they said, oh, well, we'll do it. We'll wait to let the international community do it. But that's the kind of thing where you can do pressure. I don't think it'd be so much pressure in the bond market.
Okay, gentlemen over here, please.
Rick Holliday-Smith from Aegis Partners. Mark, interested in your comments about free trade agreements and political aspects to them, also comparative advantage and disaggregation. I'd really like to get down to, I'm looking at it from an Australian point of view or a US point of view. You have totally different issues you're trying to look at. Your comment, though, was one, I think, at the end around, if you look at over the next 5 to 10 years, as if you just play in this big game with the big guys, and we're in a small market with very little scale, what actually are the implications for jobs in Australia that aren't in the mining industry? And as I visit the mining industry, jobs are being rationalised, they're getting more productivity, more capital expenditure to lower jobs. So what's happening in the rest of this economy here, and what does it look like in 10 years' time? And whatever those jobs are, which I'm quite worried about, what is like affordability for living here? What's that going to look like? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a lot of interesting and complex questions there. I think the general picture is if a lot of the structural change that's happening in Australia now is clearly being driven by the value of the Australian dollar, and it's very difficult for certain sectors of the economy, particularly manufacturing, to be able to compete in that kind of environment. And the question is, how important does the government think it it is to preserve a manufacturing sector in the economy, because it's not something you can create overnight, and once it has been undermined or disappeared, then it's very difficult to reconstitute it. So in a few years' time, one would assume that the mining boom will not be as significant as it is. I mean, it's already going into some state of decline. It may bounce back again, but the long-term issue is, how do Australians make a living who aren't involved in the mining sector? And that's a really important question, and the answers to that are not immediately obvious. But it seems to me that some kinds of assistance to manufacturers will have to be part of the process, or some long-term process of thinking of strategies to actually reduce the value and the impact of the high Australian dollar, because without some kind of assistance package of some sort, and the language is not necessarily a happy choice of phrase because it's got negative connotations, but I think it is important to recognise that without some sort of assistance, certain forms of economic activity in this country will just not be viable in the long-term future, I think. So thinking precisely what those policies might be, what those strategies might look like is the big challenge, I think.
When I interact with government, I ask those two simple questions, trying to find some response that gives me some comfort in Australia as I look out beyond my working life to my kids and grandkids. I wonder and worry that we don't have people really understanding the challenge there, and I worry that although I think over time the Australian dollar will start to reduce, my view of the world is that the other major currencies will be reducing faster for a period of time, and while that happens, we'll stay net strong. And so that's not going to be an easy solution to see the Australian dollar sort of taking us out of our current challenge, but I'm not sure who's actually thinking about how we actually deal with it. And a lot of the things that are happening around competitive advantage, and wherever there's competition, we've just got to let it flow. In our small economy, we're going to be in some difficult times, and I don't know who's thinking about it. Do you know who's thinking about it?
Well, I think about it a little bit, and some of my colleagues do, but...
not you. I know you do.
But no, a serious point is that I don't think, academics generally have a huge impact on some of these kinds of policy debates, and it's interesting who is taken seriously in terms of being able to articulate and have an audience to present particular sorts of ideas, because it's unusual for academics to be taken that seriously by an audience of this sort at the best of times. So that's an interesting kind of debate about the way that certain forms of this discussion get monopolised in certain circumstances, certain groups, and it's difficult to be able to really take part in a serious way. So I think that's part of the challenge as well.
Okay, our final intervention from Robert Hill this morning.
Well, I suppose I should say, firstly, we take academics seriously. But my question was to Claude, and I thought it was really quite provocative, what he said, and it struck me in the case of the TPP, two things. Firstly, we should recognise that this was a US political leadership initiative. So the TPP, Claude says, is being principally driven by the US for its geopolitical strategic reasons. And they are that in the past they've been bilateral, but now a recognition that Asia is perhaps becoming more cohesive and that the US doesn't wish to be excluded from it. Therefore, the US gets out in front and proposes a new trade initiative for strategic political reasons, and that it's with a bloc of countries of the Asia-Pacific rather than through its traditional bilateral links. Now, that means to me that the content of the TPP from the US perspective is not so important. There are two things, having been a politician for 22 years, that comes to me from that is, firstly, the US can't afford to lose this, having initiated it, otherwise it's a US failure vis-a-vis Asia, the most rapidly growing part of the world. And secondly, and related to that, the content is not so important because the economic opportunities that might flow for it are secondary to the strategic political benefits of being seen to be a leader in the region and in effect guiding the region to a new trade relationship. Have I read what you've said correct? And then the last part, which is not fair to ask you, but from an Australian, I then start to think, if that's the case, you know, what are we seeking from it? Are we actually, unlike the US, seeking specific economic opportunity for Australia? Or are we principally in this to support the US in its goal to be a leader, political, strategic leader in the region? Which may not be a bad thing, because you know, if we say the US investment in peace and stability in the region, huge investments since the Second World War, has been one of the reasons through which we've been able to become rich. Further supporting the US in that way mightn't be a bad thing either. But have I got you right, or have I got you wrong?
Well, I think I may have, let me say this. The economic is just as important in the United States for strong political reasons. All politics is local, and all this highfalutin stuff about, you know, American security interests and that I spouted here in diplomatic history, I think that's true, but it's also true that you're going to have to get an agreement that goes back that can pass the U.S. Congress. And the U.S. Congress will be thinking about things like, you know, cattle or textiles or cotton. It'll also be thinking, the U.S. business community also will be thinking about the advances in terms of so-called 21st century, where you begin to clear out some of the regulatory obstacles. But it's a juxtaposition. It is, I think, an important economic or trade liberalization advance if it succeeds. And again, I don't want to, we should end this now, I know, and we're going to talk about the TPP. The United States could screw this up. It really could screw it up. Because the business community so far, and I think we have a superb trade team doing this, but so far you have cleared out the underbrush, and you're really to the point where you have to make decisions beyond the U.S. Trade Representative. It's got to be in the White House. What are we going to give, where we will not give? And those decisions are still being made. But that is going to be a key, because even though this is going to be a signature achievement for Mr. Obama in his second administration, and I'm assuming he will go really be, as he said, all in out here, he'll be all in there too. This is still a trade agreement where you're balancing various economic interests in the United States. So it's a combination. Yes, I think it would be terrible if we did fail. On the other hand, I think there is only so far the administration can go without somebody saying you're giving away the store. And that's going to be fascinating, as I say, I think over the next year, because I don't think you can drag this out.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to time for our morning tea break. Please join me now in thanking our two contributors, Mark Beeson and Claude Barfield.